appreciate the time for all the folks that are here online, and he's logging in right now. We will discuss sort of the overall, the permanent fund, why it was created, sort of the budget issues that are surrounding it. Thank you, Senator Schauer, for being online right now.
That's good, thanks.
I'm not going to time any person on the debate. If a person seems to be going long, I'll try and cut them off, or I'll hit the mute button. You guys know who you are. For the record and just for an opening, I'm State Senator Scott Kawasaki. I represent Fairbanks. I will be the moderator today. I will take questions. Some questions will be on in the chat. We also have some prepared questions and questions that have come in via email, text, online through other sources, and phone calls. We've been receiving phone calls all day this afternoon. So with that, I would like to introduce the first panelist before us. We have Larry Persley. Larry was a former Department of Revenue Deputy Commissioner in administration. And if you have any opening remarks or want to just talk more about yourself, that'd be great.
Well, I can talk about myself in one sentence. I've been here almost 50 years, half the time in public service in state, federal, municipal positions, and half the time as a journalist. Money-losing journalist, I will add. I guess I volunteered for this because clearly the permanent fund dividend has become the divisive issue of Alaska politics, more so in the decades I've watched it, and particularly in the last several years. I acknowledge until we come up with a solution that's acceptable to at least 51% of Alaskans, nothing else gets done. So we need to find some way just to solve the perennial question of how big is the dividend going to be and how we're going to calculate it, and how do we pay for the dividend and all the public services that Alaskans have come to expect, demand, and lust after for free without taxes. So that's, I guess, as concise an opening statement as I can.
Very good. Thank you, Larry. Next, we have Joe Geldoff. Joe Geldoff is a member of the Permanent Fund Defenders, local attorney in town here in Juneau, and has followed politics and government for many, many years. Joe.
Well, thank you, Senator Kawasaki. I'm pleased to be here representing the Permanent Fund Defenders, an organization dedicated to protecting the permanent fund and associated issues, including the permanent fund dividend question. It's become a thorn in the side of many politicians like yourself, Senator Kawasaki, and Senator Schauer, Representative Jonathan Christ-Tompkins. It's an issue that is actually needs to be resolved. But make no mistake, the permanent fund dividend is enormously popular with the average Alaskan. And we can talk a lot about the economics and everything and about the art of the possible, but we need to solve the permanent fund dividend. And that formula, an appropriate formula, needs to be embedded in the Constitution, because if it's not, it will have this annual wrangling and fight every year in the legislature. Glad to be here.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Next, I'll introduce Senator Mike Schauer. Senator Mike Schauer has been in the legislature now for 6 years, and he serves 5 years. He serves the folks in the Mat-Su Valley. He's a retired Air Force pilot and still pilots when he's not in special session. Senator Schauer.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be here. Actually, you just gave a pretty good intro for who I am, so I don't think I need to take more time. Might as well get right into the meat of it. So happy to be here tonight to debate it. And I know one of the things we'll talk about is the fiscal policy working group, which all three of us as legislators were on. And we'll get into the details of it, but I think it should be a good discussion. So looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you, Senator. Next, we have Representative Jonathan Christ-Tompkins. Jonathan Christ-Tompkins has been involved in politics for many, many years. I remember as a young, I think, high school student, you might have even been younger than that, helping me out on my first campaign decades ago. And now he's serving in the Alaska State Legislature. He's been there for, this will be his 10th year. And I know that you have news that just came out yesterday that you will not be seeking re-election. We thank you for your service and thank you for your time. And job's not done yet. So we're pleased to have Representative Jonathan Christ-Tompkins online.
Yeah, thanks so much, Scott. I remember being involved in, I think it was your 2002 campaign website back in the early days of internet plus politics. So I was like gawky teenager, if that. But yeah, excited to be here. And I think the only opening comment I would offer is that the dividend is obviously hugely important, and at least for me, there's a strong interconnection between the dividend and the permanent fund from which the dividend comes, and that interrelationship is hugely important, and getting it right has been a guiding principle for me in terms of trying to settle these questions in a sustainable way.
Great, thank you. And then thanks to the viewers, we now have 76 viewers online, so we just doubled over the last couple minutes here. Just so that I can re-mention again, is that we are going to be asking a couple prepared questions of the folks. We aren't going to be timing individuals as for how long that they're online. If a person has something that they want to say based on what somebody else had said, please chime in. I'll try and moderate the best I can from here. We're also taking questions online, so folks are sending in questions. Representative Kevin McCabe just says he's watching us. Laugh out loud. And there are several other people that are now sending in questions. So we will be asking some of those questions as time permits. So let's just go ahead and get started. Just the first question that we have on the list is sort of I guess it's sort of a softball, but and whoever wants to start can start. Since 2016, the governor and the legislature have appropriated the permanent fund dividend with an amount less than the statutory formula established in 1982. Part of the reason cited for this reduction has been the state does not have enough money to pay a full PFD and provide services that are required under the Constitution. Do you agree with the statement? Disagree with the statement? How would you recommend the state come up with necessary funding to provide both a full PFD while still providing the services essential to Alaskans, families, and businesses that are requested of us every year? And whoever wants to start, please.
Well, sure. So you can't pay the full statutory PFD under the 1982 formula and continue all the services that we're providing long term. I'm not talking about today's $100 oil, but longer term. You can't do it unless you have more money, because otherwise the checks are going to bounce. So that means either exceeding the 5% limit on drawing from the permanent fund each year, 5% of the market value, or taxes. I just don't see how it bounces otherwise.
Well,
Thanks for starting us off. Go ahead, Joe.
I would add, the question's a little bit loaded. The state does not have enough money to pay a full PFD. That's wrong. The state does have, and I'm picking up on Larry's thread a little bit here, the state has enough money to pay a full statutory PFD. What it doesn't have is enough money to pay the full PFD and a quite augmented and enhanced, even bloated state government that's also giving away a lot of tax credits and free money to a lot of things that nobody considers charity.
This is great. I guess I can chime in, sort of completing the quartet here, or being metaphor. Great red meat sort of dangled by Joe, and I wouldn't disagree that there's a big problem with the tax credits, although I don't think that's necessarily the silver bullet solution. And although Joe has been involved in some pretty relevant litigation on that subject, even the oil tax credits would not singularly make the math, I think, workable, at least in my mind. I mean, for the PFD, I'm not. I think there's two things I would say. First, the statutory formula, something that I think is underestimated was written when the reality of the permanent fund was very, very different from what it is now. And there's a lot of volatility in the way the PFD formula exists. It was written in a way that the permanent fund was very stable. It was primarily stocks and bonds, and there was no private equity, there was no real estate, there were none of these other asset classes that exist now, which create these sort of wild distortions in the valuation of the fund or statutory income in the fund, and therefore what the dividend should be in any given year. And so that's just sort of one thing that I would throw out, that regardless of what your perspective is on how big or small the dividend should be, the formula is a little bit outdated just in that regard, in terms of the volatility that exists from when it was written and what was contemplated when the formula was written. The second thing I would say is, if we want to have a dividend in the $3,000 a year range, like, great, I'm not opposed to that, but we just need a lot more revenue for it, because there's just not enough money to go around unless you start robbing from the fund itself or taxing the real value of the fund itself. And so if we want to have a dividend that large, which I wouldn't be opposed to, we just need to raise a lot more revenue. And part of the problem is the legislature and sort of elected leaders collectively have failed to do that. And there have been people who've stuck their head out. Former Governor Bill Walker is one. I think Senator Shower actually has demonstrated a lot of leadership in recognizing the reality around revenue. I'm pro-revenue to some extent, and to be clear, everybody is, to different degrees. I'm not saying Mike and I are, exactly in the same boat for the amount of revenue, but at least, Mike has recognized that reality. So I was just going to say there's this critical interrelationship between revenue and the size of the dividend, and the two need to be considered in concert with each other.
Okay, so I guess it's my turn, get to go last. Probably a good idea. We rotate a little bit and everybody gets a chance to listen to everybody else and continue. I'll a couple points here, take notes as we go through it. First of all, I do disagree with how they handled this many decades ago, because I think Hammond was right that we should have kept a tax. And one of the reasons I say that is not because I'm pro-tax. I'm not. I would like to see the smallest possible tax, if no tax, if we could do that. We've had a wonderful run for 40 years, well, almost 40, where we didn't have to do that and oil paid the bills. But when you don't tie taxes or what comes out of somebody's wallet, well, then they really don't care what the government does. It's OPM, other people's money. So it's easy to spend that. And that's kind of been part of why I look at, where you're talking about the spending and reductions, like Joe said. I agree, there's room to reduce. We found that in the Fiscal Policy Working Group, but spending has increased when you look at the size of the population, nearly double in the last 20-ish years or so, since 2000. But our population only went up by about 12-14%. So we're not really keeping pace with that. And so we've allowed things, I think, to get out of control. I do think we should change the spending cap in the Constitution, because it has a flight path like that. It should have been like that. That's another thing we discussed that perhaps would have kept us from being here. The estimates are upwards of $130 billion would be in the fund now. Have we done that? So there's a couple different things tied. And just the last two comments for the moment. In one sense, if we were to have a dividend paid that was larger and then enacted a tax, it becomes in its own way like a means test, because we've talked about that. The courts have said we can't do that. But if you pay a larger dividend, and then those of us that are better off, we can just use that dividend to pay that tax. I mean, that's really what you're doing. You're just transferring it from one to the other, fine. But what you help are the people that don't have to pay as much in taxes, the middle class, especially the bottom half of that, and the poor. They're going to be able to keep the dividend. That's going to help them. And it kind of gets us to where we want to be without, the rich, so-called, or the better off. Last point for the moment, because I know this will generate more discussion, but it's been a continual struggle, as both Scott and Jonathan know. I was going to say JKT, Jonathan knows, is, the 5% POMV has presented a challenge, because the formula is in conflict, not really in conflict like Joe said, and I agree it's not, but we've allowed it become a conflict. And so one of our problems is, which law do we follow? We have people right now saying, well, we got to follow that POMV. I'm like, well, we're not following statutory law. And I know the court said that, but the courts have said we can do whatever we want. We need to solve the problem, because we've set ourselves up for this. So that's enough. I'll stop there as we circle around. Thanks.
Anybody want to follow up? Otherwise, I can ask another question. So part of that question had to deal with if we do have a deficit. Jonathan mentioned the deficit, Senator Shower. Also, Mike mentioned the deficit. Where do we come up with the added revenue necessary to fund that full PFD, as well as the services that are essential?
Well, let me take a stab at a couple things and clear up and following on Senator Shower's points. The permanent fund defenders, and I think most people who look and have taken a long look at the permanent fund and the dividend, that relationship that Jonathan Christ-Tompkins talked about there, they don't necessarily want a high dividend. That's desirable if the market conditions are great and if the fund is earning a lot of money. But in and of itself, paying a big dividend should not be the goal. Giving the citizens of Alaska a little slice of the earnings from their account and having that connection between the account and their dividend is the real goal, at least in my view and the view of the permanent fund defenders. Maintaining that connection is essential to protect the long-term viability of the permanent fund, because if the average citizen can't relate to the fund and know that they're going to get a little interest, whatever the formula is, and that interest can't be hijacked by the politicians, it's embedded in the Constitution, then sooner or later the permanent fund will fail. Because it's just like your bank account. If you don't get any interest, even a measly passbook account, what the heck? It just goes away. Another thing that came up is this is not a partisan issue. We have people like Senator Kawasaki and Senator Shower who are in different parties, but they're both strong supporters of the permanent fund and solving the permanent fund dividend. There are a number of Democrats who have been very forward in seeking to protect the permanent fund dividend. There are a number of Republicans like Senator Hughes and Senator Meyer up in the Fairbanks area who have been staunch supporters of the dividend. So I would like people to realize this isn't a partisan issue. It's a brutally difficult financial issue. And what makes it difficult because it involves cuts, taxation, and payment of interest to the citizens. I come down and the permanent fund defenders, we're a citizens first, not a government first. That doesn't mean we're anti-government, but the first straw ought to be a reasonable PFD for the citizens to keep that connection going.
Well, I'll make a comment. Joe, under that logic, what you're saying is that we think so little of Alaskans that if they're not getting a cut from the permanent fund, they won't care what happens to it. And that's kind of a sad commentary.
Well, let me rebut that. I trust the collective wisdom of Alaskans in their individual behavior. But what happens in the Capitol when it comes to divvying up the loot is the people with lobbyists and lawyers and that mobilize their voice. There's an insidious phenomenon that goes on. The people with the power and the people with the time overwhelm the individual voices. I trust the individuals, when they get a dividend, however it's set, some of them waste it, a lot of them spend it on, books or whatever they need, fuel for, subsistence hunting, Do some people gamble it away and waste it? Yeah, but the collective effort of individuals who receive that, it largely goes back into the economy. It's great for the private sector, and we ought to be enhancing and augmenting individual choice here and not just trusting the bureaucrats and the politicians to spend most of the money.
Yeah, but you talk about bureaucrats like it's the Antichrist or some devil. And you talk about insidious infections in the Capitol like it's this cabal that is out to ruin common man. We're a representative form of government. Generally, in my 46 years here, legislators represent their constituents, and most do a very good job of it. So I guess I admit I bristle at this notion that if Alaskans aren't getting a cut from the permanent fund, then they won't care about it. Well, gee, that sounds like the end of the world's coming if people are that selfish. Yeah, the dividend's great. I agree with you. And people can make individual choices, but gee, I thought I was cynical. You're worse.
This is great. I'm gonna jump in because Larry and Joe are making Senator Schauer and I hopefully look like just icons of diplomacy. Although I love the banter. I was just gonna say, I think the dividend is an important program for Alaska, and there's a lot of very, very strong arguments for the dividend being around. And for me, part of the reasoning to make hard decisions now and to protect the permanent fund in a complete and constitutional way is to make sure that things like the dividend are around in 50 years. The one comment that was made by Joe that I have never quite found full logic with is the need for the dividend to protect the permanent fund itself. And in my mind, really actually the opposite has existed in the past few years, and that some of the more charged politics around the dividend have imperiled and put the permanent fund itself at risk. That's not to say I don't think the dividend needs protection. Ideally, we make a series of very difficult decisions, including taxes, including cuts, and create constitutional protection for the permanent fund and the dividend right now, and do all of those in a coordinated way. But I'm not sure that the dividend in and of itself actually affords the permanent fund a sort of, halo of protection, because I feel like at least some political behavior could be pointed at to suggest the opposite has happened.
Jonathan, let me jump in for a minute. Now you and I can be the paragons of going back. So I appreciate, I know that this group is, we'll have some, probably make some funny faces here, but it's okay to disagree at the end of the day. One thing I agree a little bit more with Joe, a little less with Larry on this one. That's just my take of watching things inside the legislature. And sure, some of you have been around longer, but, I do see from my perspective, a lot of special interests that are in that Capitol building, and the people, and I get it when people say, well, we wouldn't have a lot of interest, people wouldn't show up. We'll never know that if it stays at Juneau, because you can't afford to get there to be that involved. And when we have town halls and stuff, we have hundreds of people show up. So I don't really buy the notion that people would not be more involved if it was more accessible to them, but that's a different discussion. I say it for this reason. What you do see in the Capitol every day are lobbyists and special interest and union people coming through. And guess what, folks? They want their slice of the pie. So when people try to tell me that, well, the people, they're not interested. Why? I actually think they are, because and this is where I disagree with Jonathan just a little bit in this one. If we didn't have the permanent fund dividend, and I agree with Joe, over the last number of years, I believe Jay Hammond was spot on, because we've started taking the dividend out of people's wallets, and what has happened? It's become the issue in the state of Alaska, because people go, what are you doing? And quite frankly, I feel like had there not been a PFD where people had been tied to this, it would be the fund for government to use however it wanted. Maybe they would be good with it. Maybe they would have spent it. There's no way to know that. But I do see value, just like I started off where I said taxes tie the spending of government to people's wallets so that they pay attention to it. When we started touching the dividend, it did exactly one of the things that was predicted. People said, what are you doing? And they've been mad and yelling and screaming and getting involved. And it has put us on notice that now we have to pay attention to it. We can't just do what we want. So I actually do see some wisdom to having that tied to the fund, because we're politicians and we know that. And anybody that would try to argue we don't spend the money we're given would be shown to be a fool. We'll spend every dollar you give us, if we're not careful. And that's not necessarily everybody. And I don't disagree with Larry that not everybody is a bad servant or a bad person because they're in government service. I just see that we spend money if it's given to us. And if we have something that ties us to the people or a fund, that's really what generates the interest. And otherwise, I think people, again, it's other people's money. It's this ethereal thing that's way out there. They don't care if government's spending money if it doesn't affect them. And that's partly why, again, I think we got here, because we could spend money, as some of you guys mentioned, over the decades, and oil companies paid for it. Now we're at the crux of the issue that Scott and Jonathan and I have had to deal with, and finding the solution, which is, quite frankly, why we're all here tonight. So for what it's worth.
Yeah, so let me just interject here. We have a couple comments that are in the chat, and it was also brought up, I think, both by both of the members who served on the fiscal policy work group about an income tax. There's a lot of folks who talk about what Hammond would have wanted, what Hammond had talked about. As late as 2002, when we had the Conference of Alaskans rejoin back up at the University of Alaska, they talked about fiscal responsibility. Hammond was there. He actually talked about his proposal. He wanted to have full permanent fund dividends, and he talked about the need for them. He also said that he wanted to reinstate the income tax. So you had both a high dividend, PFD, paid to the people, and an income tax that essentially would be equal to the permanent fund dividend. I think during the time that they repealed the state income tax back in '80, he called that the most stupid thing we could do. Do you guys have a comment about that? Because a lot of people do talk about what Hammond would have wanted. He doesn't, and it's clear that he wanted both taxes and a PFD.
I can go first.
After my elder Larry, I can take a number.
I'll go first real quick just to get it out of the way.
Yeah, I think Senator should.
Yeah, I've been going last. It's kind of a unfair advantage when you go last. You get to listen to everybody. So I think I did just mention this before, so I won't take but a moment here. Jay Hammond had some things definitely right and some thoughts of the people, because he was definitely kind of a guy of the people as a politician. So there's something to be said for that. But I do believe that to have the most interest of the people that we serve, we have to stay connected to them. And as I mentioned before, I think maybe Jay was almost thinking of the fact that, a way to means test, even though the court shot that down, is to pay that dividend out of our resource wealth that has been extracted and put somewhere else, because it's not an entitlement and the other things people talk about. It's our wealth that we're distributing to our citizens via dividend. But if you don't have something that ties to the person's wallet, by and large, they don't stay engaged. And I think a tax of some sort, and I don't support an income tax. We know that that's another debate in the battle. We had that in the fiscal policy working group, but some kind of a tax is probably coming if we're going to pay this. And that's the balance we'll talk about a little bit later. So I think you have to have some tie to the people. And if you don't do that, and there's a number of conservatives and Republicans that think that too, just to be clear, that we understand there has to be some connection here. And the days of oil companies just paying for us to spend whatever we want are probably clearly past. And so now we're into the new territory. That's my pitch.
Yeah, I love Senator Shower's OPM coinage, which I haven't heard, but other people's money. And I think that's totally right, and highlights, I think, what Governor Hammond was partly getting at with the taxes. In my mind, having a broad-based tax in Alaska is just as or more important in terms of ensuring fiscal responsibility in the legislature as paying the dividend, and creates a real linkage because everybody has skin in the game. And I mean, Senator Shower and I have, difference in perspective and sort of a agree to disagree situation on what kind of tax makes the most sense. I'm definitely much more pro income tax and voted for one, in 2016 or whatever that was. And very proud of that vote. But I mean, income tax or other kind of broad-based tax, we definitely need something. And the longer we don't have it, I think the harder it will be to solve this. And I think Governor Hammond seemed to have a similar perspective, although I wasn't there in the Conference of Alaskans back around the turn of the millennium, I should say.
I'll just throw in, I think at the time of the creation of the permanent fund and the dividend, I don't think Jay Hammond or anyone else envisioned a statutory formula that could create $3,000 dividends, or envision oil fluctuating that time between $9 and $120 and running through $14 billion in constitutional budget reserves. I trust the legislators we have to come up with an answer without having to try to channel what would Jay Hammond have thought. No offense, Joe.
Well, I was a big fan of Jay Hammond, but Jay Hammond's a revered figure, but remember, he had two close elections. He's now entered the mists of history, but he wasn't always right. But he was a decent guy who worked hard.
Sure.
But here's what I want to remind Jonathan about the dividend. The dividend is a reflection of the ownership interest that current and future Alaskans have in their savings account. I believe, and I think most politicians who look at this, if you solve the permanent fund dividend, and by solving, I mean putting a formula that works, doesn't necessarily have to be the standard, but there's room to debate. But you fix the permanent fund dividend formula by putting a reasonable formula in the Constitution, then and only then can you deal with the revenue and the government services thing, because they will be head to head and they will resolve. But as long as there's this three-way fight, it's not just, it's hard enough dealing with revenue and government, but you add a third element, it's 10 times more difficult. So the first thing to do is solve this open wound of the permanent fund dividend, come up with a reasonable formula, put it in the Constitution, then the issue of government services meeting revenue and vice versa will resolve. And I think that's the approach that we take. And there was a lot of hard work by the meeting that all three of you were on, all three of the legislatures were on here. But this idea that we're going to come up with this grand bargain, the ultimate solution, solve all these problems, it won't happen. And the most important, the corner piece of the jigsaw puzzle is the PFD. Solve that and the other things will resolve.
Thanks, Joe. Since you brought up the Constitution, I'll ask another question, get us to a different line of talking. Since the dividend was vetoed in 2016, there's been discussion about constitutionalizing the dividend. Some proposals include putting a formula in the Constitution. Others would simply add language to the Constitution to, in effect, the legislature shall distribute a permanent fund dividend, and then leave it in the statutes to be debated. Do you support that sort of a constitutional dividend? What do you think? What do you think about it?
I might jump in because I think there might be a third option, one that Senator Schauer and I know have spoken about, and I think I can't actually remember what was in our recommendations, but may have been endorsed by the working group process, which is a constitutional amendment that says there shall be a dividend, and not just like there shall be a dividend constitutional amendment, which speaking frankly, I think is kind of a cop-out and doesn't really do much of anything, but there shall be a dividend as provided by law, and basically affording constitutional protection to whatever the statute and law is. So there's a little bit of a middle ground in that you have the formula in statute, but whatever that formula is, is sort of given, constitutional authority. So the formula would be liable to change, although there would be extraordinary political scrutiny to doing so. I think it's fair to say, at least given how difficult it's been to change the formula for the last 40 years. It's hopefully a fair statement. But would be given that sort of constitutional force. And just speaking personally, I could vote for that constitutional amendment. And speaking politically, in terms of counting heads, I know Joe or Senator Schauer would potentially be more comfortable or would even prefer a constitutional amendment that enshrines a specific formula in the Constitution. And, I know where they're coming from, even if I have a different perspective, but just from a head counting perspective, given that you need 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, I think it's just a reality in terms of who's in the legislature in this moment, that constitutional amendment wouldn't, I don't think, and Senator Schauer may have a different head count than I, get close to the 2/3. I think a constitutional amendment that says there shall be a dividend as provided by law, I think that might be right on the bubble of 2/3. And I at least just wanted to flag that that's perhaps an additional option.
I'll jump in here for a minute, and then we can get Larry and Joe to maybe comment on the blood sport here. So Jonathan's right, very close, but this is the language I remember. We'd have to look it up, but as I remember it being, we had a lot of lawyers help us vet this and talk through it. A couple like Bill Wilikowski, who's been a big supporter of the statutory dividend, Fritz Pettyjohn, some of you would remember Fritz, and others that have kind of studied this issue on the outside. And I believe what the language said, or it's very close to this, was a dividend shall be, this is what the Fiscal Policy Working Group unanimously agreed to in the end after a lot of debate. There shall be a dividend every year paid in accordance with the statute, and the statute can't be changed without a vote of the people. That was a hook and kind of our last part that I think Jonathan didn't have, as I remember. We'd have to look at it for sure, but that was, and remember, all of us had to step off our positions. That was the key thing here, because everybody had to kind of step off to get to this 50-50 of the percent of market value if you were to have that plan that's been kind of floating around out there. But for some people, they didn't want the statutory formula and the Constitution. Other people didn't want, wanted it in there. Other people, I mean, so it's kind of bounced around, right? And what we looked at was that you can have the ability to change it by not putting the formula in. And some of us had to kind of come off of our position and agree to that. But at the same time, one of the concerns, and Jonathan remembers this well, I know Scott does, is that some of us that are more would like to see the statutory formula, or that's where our kind of hook is. We said, well, if you don't put in something that says it cannot be changed without a vote of the people, then you've essentially left us wide open to right where we are today. It says it shall be paid every year, but what shall be paid? What the statute says? Well, we've been blowing that off. And so then we get back into the argument of the courts that have said you can do whatever you want because you're the lawmakers. So the only thing the constitutional amendment in that case would say is there shall be a PFD paid. Is it $1? Is it 1,000, 3,000? So that was our kind of grand compromise as I remember it. JKT, I hope I'm close on that, but it was, hey, it will be paid. It will be in accordance with the statute. So there's room to wiggle later, but the people have to approve it. And that was our final hook. And so I throw that out because, we have 21, 11, 1, and I add 5. You're right. You got to have 21 House members, 11, Senate members, the governor, and 5 on the Supreme Court, quite frankly, because that's where a lot of these things go, and higher bar if it's constitutional. And we have the math problem and we have the political problem. And that's what was so daunting. You can solve the math, or you might be able to solve the political problem. It's getting both right that makes this difficult. And that's where our big problem has been. And so I think Joe and I probably, maybe even Scott, would fall on a different side of this. Maybe Larry and JKT, based on the setup, would fall maybe on the other side. But this was our attempt to try to go somewhere in the middle that would, as Joe has clearly said, and I agree with, we have to solve this problem. Because until we solve this, we're not getting anything else done, folks. This is taking the auction out of the room. So that's my take from that. And I agree with Jonathan and Scott on how we worked in the, I don't know, over to the gentleman with more experience to discuss.
I agree with Senator Schauer. It's a political and a math problem. So it's not so much what do I want, but what's achievable, what's going to work, what's going to be lasting, what can get the 2/3 in the Senate and 2/3 in the House and public support. So I think that's where everyone's going to have to say, what is a good solution for Alaska rather than, well, what I want. Yeah, I'm not governor. I haven't run for legislature. So I agree. You got to look at, solve the math, solve the politics, come up with something that works, that doesn't stymie providing for K-12, doesn't create fiscal problems. It's a challenge. It really is. And I admire everyone who's trying.
Well, the fiscal working group, there was some hard work there that yielded some compromises. Whether it would get the 14 and the 28 you need, the political votes, is still an open question. But I will just say this, for the last 7 or 8 years, there's been a complete lack of leadership out of the executive branch. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of chatter, there's a lot of chip in their teeth, a lot of promises, but there's no genuine leadership. And that goes to Governor Walker, who, I think somewhat naively vetoed the fund, which precipitated this ongoing fight. And that extends to Governor Dunleavy, who talks a lot about this, but in fact is not listening to the legislators and basically just makes statements and then disappears out to, hunting camp or off to some place. But, both governors, and now they're both in their own ways incumbent, and they both want to be governors again. There's been a real lack of leadership, by which I mean not just talking, but listening to the legislatures, trying to find that 14 and 28, using their ears instead of their mouths here. And the public's had it, and the public's confused. They love the statutory formula because it worked for 3 decades. I think anybody who's assessing this realizes the statutory formula is very unlikely to get 14 and 28 and wind up as a resolution. It's not going to happen. But I salute Senator Schauer, you and Senator Kawasaki and Jonathan for trying to come up with something to get that 28 that might work. But don't kid yourself. The public is really wary of, we'll pay it, but it's subject to change even if we get a vote on it. There's a lot of distrust on this issue because the 6 years where they haven't had the full statutory thing, but we got to keep working on it. But we should move into this whole POMV, because I've got some maybe harsh things to say about the percentage of market value and the so-called 50-50 divvy up the loot scheme.
Hey, Scott, before we go there, can I just make one comment? Because it's very
You bet, Mike.
genuine. Thank
Go
you.
for it.
When you hear all of us talking here, and this is, I think, and certainly the legislators know it, and I know Larry and Joe, you guys pay attention to this, but one of the concerns people have, and I think we're headed that way, and Scott, you have polling from last summer that shows this before you even talk about things like the PFD, is a constitutional convention. We've always voted no, but I will tell you, I listened to Joe and I think he's spot on. The people are frustrated, they're fed up, they're done. They're tired of it, and you see the momentum heading in that direction. That's not my preferred path. I would like to see us do what we did. We work and we try to find and vet good, solid solutions that have time. But I'll tell you, folks, I think we're about to, my impression watching the legislature is we're probably going to torpedo this. We're not going to solve the problem in the next month and a half, 2 months. I think you're going to lead us right into a constitutional convention. I think the people are going to vote for it, and then it's fights on. Who knows how that's going to play out? And we very well may see the formula put in there by a vote of the majority of the people. So we may have been setting ourselves up for this, but I only bring this out because we may want to discuss this tonight, because quite frankly, at this point, I'm going to be a fan of it, of saying maybe we need to do that if we can't solve it. But at some point, folks, we have to solve the problem. And at the end of the day, regardless of your politics, we haven't solved the problem. And that's exactly what Joe was talking about with leadership on all sides. I mean, I don't know what Scott and JKT think about this. My last comment is we did a lot of work to present something that had passed to move us forward. And the leadership in both bodies, for the most part, has failed to even entertain it. So how are we going to solve the problem? That's my question. And if we're not going to solve it, then I think the people are going to take it out of our hands and do it themselves. And that can be dangerous, but so be it. Just thought that was maybe worth pointing out.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. We do have a question later on. Somebody in the chat room mentioned a constitutional convention and what the process would be and things like that. So we will talk about that here a little bit later. I wanted to get though, since Mike, Jonathan, and Joe both talked about the percent of market value. The Comprehensive Fiscal Plan Working Group over the summer did discuss this and entertain it. And in the end, we made a recommendation. The recommendation was to have a percent of market value based dividend formula. It was also to put it in the Constitution. Or actually, I don't know if it was actually to put it in the Constitution, but at least it was to make a constitutional PFD. Let's see, the recommendations were adopted unanimously. 8 members spent the entire summer working on this, proposed it in August to the legislature, and it didn't go very far, as Mike has said. So what do you think about whether it's Governor Dunleavy's 50-50 plan? 50% of the POMV draw would go toward dividends. The remaining 50% would go toward general fund for education, public safety, public health, infrastructure, and those types of things.
Well, I can kick off, I guess. Generally speaking, a POMV-based formula, setting aside what the numbers are, obviously a hugely important variable, but a POMV-based formula makes tons of sense to me. And it's just, I think, sort of the right unit that we should be using. And that was a recommendation from the working group. And different perspectives what the numbers should be, to be clear, but the fact that it was a POMV-based formula was a common point of thinking. In terms of the actual numbers, Scott, you mentioned 50% and 50%. So the PFD formula would be 50% of the market value of the permanent fund. I am wary of that, but as I've said before, I think my perspective on the dividend is informed by and conditional on what else is happening in terms of taxes and in terms of the budget. And I think it would be I am opposed. I would not be able to get to yes on a 50% POMV formula without major action on those other two pieces. And absent that initiative, I think there's been a deficit of leadership, broadly speaking, in terms of action on those two issues, although there's been also some remarkable positive examples of leadership on those two in the last 4 to 6 years as well. But absent action on those two issues, I don't think 50% of the market value makes sense. But there is a way I can sort of get off my mark and I could get to yes if so this is where the conditional part comes in, there were meaningful action. So I think this is where the sort of interconnectedness of it all comes in.
Well, I'm going to jump in and tell you why using a percentage of market value, the often discussed POMV, has real dangers for the long-term viability of the permanent fund. And this isn't just Joe Geldoff, worn out lawyer spitballing this. The Callan Group, which is the longtime advisor of the Permanent Fund Corporation, is extremely wary, and they're sending out cautionary statements about using a POMV pegged at 5%. And underlying that, using a POMV converts the permanent fund, which is a form of a trust fund, into an endowment. That means if you pick the wrong percentage, and there's people love POMVs because it guarantees money for government. It would guarantee, depending on how you structure it, money for a PFD. But if you set the number too high, it's an automatic draw, and it will start draining the permanent fund at some point. That's the real danger here. So when Governor Dunleavy talks about, use a POMV 50-50. 50-50 sounds really attractive. That mirrors the 1982 statutory language. And it sounds fair, I guess. But if the number's too high and 5% is too high, if you don't believe me, dial up the Callan people, the advisors who are saying 5% is too high. And that was before we started into this long run, or what seems to be an increasingly long run, of inflation. Remember, the permanent fund is not automatically inflation proof. That's in the same statute that says pay the PFD. That's up to people like Senator Schauer and Senator Stedman and the people who control the money to inflation proof that. We're into an inflationary times here, and I am really concerned that a POMV will start draining the permanent fund if we set the level too high. So I'll stop nattering on there, but everybody who's in love with the POMV, who really likes it? The trustees at the permanent fund, because they got liquidity problems. The administrators at the permanent fund, because they want certainty. The people who are in state government and want state government spending, and people who are big government advocates, they like a POMV because there's a guaranteed dish. There's problems there.
Sure.
Before Larry responds, I'll
Joe, before you discussion without accusing public employees of being at the trough to the detriment of the public.
I'm not. The only people I'm ripping on here are Governor Dunleavy and then a little bit.
Just leave it, Governor Dunleavy, and leave the other 15,000 public employees off of it.
I'm a former public employee, Larry.
Exactly.
There are some great public servants around here, but Larry, we got a government problem in the state. We've got too much of it, and it's inefficient in some ways, and there's too many people on the payroll that don't add value to the citizens of this state.
Before Larry and Joe go at that one real quick, I just want to add one little thing in here. I think it's a little over 20,000 actually at the last count, Larry, and that's fine. I mean,
counting university and all the rest. You're right.
Yeah, you bet. And it is high. I mean, we're the highest in the nation per capita for state employees. Everybody's got their opinion. That's okay. I think it could be smaller, but I tend to agree with Joe a little more on the size of it. But that being said, just two quick comments, and I'll let you guys go back at it. I have gotten those briefings and talked quite a bit with Callan and others, including AFPC. I've tried really hard for the last 5 years to get into the weeds so I understand it. There is concern about the POMV. What he talks about, that is real because it does pull money every single year. The statutory formula corrects for that. And when I go backwards, and this is maybe the most germane comment, and somebody made it earlier, and I don't remember who it was, I think it was Joe, is that the people were never concerned about the amount of PFD. It could have been $500, could have been $5,000. They didn't care. If we were following the law, it was never an issue. We screwed this up when Governor Walker started just arbitrarily setting the amount. Bill Wielechowski's case, the courts ruled in and said you can do what you want. Now people are mad. Had we followed the formula, which like we talked about is correcting, you could have had a small PFD in those deflationary periods. It would have been fine. We've set ourselves up for this battle because we stopped following the statute. And so there is some danger here that is real that we need to discuss about how we move forward with this. And I don't disagree with them. I just want to throw that out because I think that is important. The people were never mad about a small PFD. They've gotten mad because we stopped following the law. And that's a problem we need to solve. So for what it's worth.
Well, I just want to add to Joe's comments. I think it's sort of a divide the question situation. I mean, Joe makes a point that I couldn't agree more with. In fact, have advocated myself, which is, but I mean, Joe, you're saying POMV bad. I don't think POMVs are inherently bad. They can be terrible if the draw is too high, but it's a separate question what the draw is. And I personally would love to see a 4.5% draw or a 4.75% draw, a conservative draw that ensures that the fund grows over time in real terms and make sure that the dividend and the other half of the draw are sustainable in the long term and that you're appropriately hedged against risk like inflation or market corrections or whatever. But POMVs as a class of policy are not inherently bad, but you can really screw the pooch if you make the draw too high, which is a separate question. And to be clear, the legislature is fully possible of making a terrible decision in terms of what that draw should be and the draw being too high. And I think it's a real risk. So, but I just think it's worth dividing that question.
Well, I will give you that. The POM, the percentage of market value, turning it into an endowment, if it was at 4% or very close to 4%, it probably works. Why? Because your rate of return on investments over a 100-year cycle, which is what you need to do when you're dealing with something, the permanent fund, is about 4%. So you're probably not going to screw it up at 4%. You go to 5%, and you got people like the Callan Group going, warning, 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 and we should take their advice. But we'll get there. If we had more people like you, Jonathan, and Senator Kawasaki, Senator Schauer, who are working on this and paying attention, we might be able to get our 14 and 28 on something. I'm not, and I don't think the permanent fund defenders are. I remember talking to Clem Tillian last August before he died, and he said, I don't like the POMV because it gets rid of the trust thing. But if we get it and there's a reasonable PFD on something like 4% or a little higher than 4%, we could probably live with it. Now, it's always good tactic. I mean, I learned this from Larry Pursley. Invoking a celebrated dead person is always good practice because you can't cross-examine them. But, I'm not categorically against, nor are the permanent fund defenders categorically against a percentage of market value. But don't kid yourself. The public isn't buying it at this point. They still love the statutory formula. We've got our work cut out for us, all of us who care about this issue, to come up with something that's reasonable, responsible, and treats Alaskans equally in terms of a PFD. We can do it, but it would help if there was a little more leadership out of the executive branch instead of all the platitudes and the campaign slogans.
I want one comment here, Scott, before I think Larry wants to jump in. He's been
really very brief.
It will be very brief, Larry. I promise you can reach
No,
out
that's
with
fine.
that. So is that if we're going to do this, and I've acknowledged this too through the fiscal policy working group, I keep mentioning it because I wish our leadership in the legislature would pay attention to it, is that the math doesn't work. I'm okay with the statutory formula because, again, I go back to, I think that helps the people that need it the most in the state, and I can live with that. But I've acknowledged the math does not work long term. To do that, you're going to need some reductions to spending where we can find them, and you're going to have to tax. You're going to need a sales tax. I'm a sales tax guy. Why? Not because it's practical, because an income tax doesn't have the support. So what I'm trying to say here, gents, as we get into this discussion is that at the end of the day, this is part of the other problem, right? The math problem. The math has to work. And if you pay a statutory formula at the current spend rate for government with what we have available, we have to start drawing down the fund to get there. That's not a viable long-term solution for us. So the math has to work too. And that's why even somebody like me that likes the statutory formula wants to hold on to it. If we can't get there from here, or we screw it up and the people take it from us in a constitutional convention, we got a math problem, and that has to work. I'm done. Thanks, Larry. Back to you.
I was just going to say, through the chair, I second Senator Schauer's motion that when the legislature and the governor said, well, we're not going to follow the law because we can't afford it, that created a political problem. They need to change the law. No question about it. And then that's the political problem, finding the votes to do it. But every year the legislature gets together, and there's a lot of ad hoc spending decisions that aren't governed by law. It sort of depends who's in the majority and how much money there is. Well, the dividend shouldn't be subject to that, but you got to change that law. Senator's right.
Great, thank you. Just as a recap, we
I have a
only
follow-up.
about a half an hour. Hang on, Joe. We only have about a half an hour. We have about 50 questions that have now been added to the queue. We're only through the third or fourth, and I think I like the debate. And folks are responding online, also liking the debate. But if we can sort of make your answers a little bit more direct and short, thank you.
I have a yes or no for Larry. So changing the law, does that mean change the law and put it in the Constitution, the PFD formula? Yes or no?
To me, no, but politically, you're probably going to have to.
That's very short.
That's a short answer.
Short.
You did exactly right.
So I have a question. The price of oil at this moment's obviously much higher than we've seen. We had the spring forecast just came out a few days ago. The spring forecast says over the next 2 years, we'll have $3.6 billion more than anticipated in revenue coming in. If oil prices obviously remain roughly where they're at today, and then they fluctuate between $120 at the high just a couple days ago until about, I think it's under 100 now. So the price of oil at this moment, does that alleviate our fiscal constraints, at least temporarily? Do you think there will be a full PFD, should be a full PFD? Do you think you want to go with what the House majority has talked about as a $1,300 one-time payment to help alleviate the costs of high energy, particularly because of oil products here in the state and inflation? So do you support any of those? Why or why not?
All right, I'll go. It was quiet. So I do believe that we should pay it right now. Not just as a matter of good faith. The law still says it, so we follow it until we have the courage to change it, which we've been talking about. So change the doggone law, and then I'll follow that. So I think we should. I think that right now, as I've used my fire extinguisher example, that we need to pay it because it would also be very helpful to an economy that's struggling and people are trying to crawl out of the COVID debacle we've had. So I believe that we follow it as we have the courage to change it. I believe it's very helpful to the people right now. We should do it anyways. We already know based on the current numbers, as you said, Scott, we can do this without even 1 penny of deficit spending right now. So I think it's important anyways because of the helpful factor. And I do, and I'll say this, and Jonathan can speak to his, I disagree with this calling it an energy relief because to me because it becomes a political thing. And I'm not saying Jonathan did that. I'm saying just from the House perspective, he can answer, who thought why, but I want it tied to the PFD. That's where the earnings are coming from. And I think that if we're going to say we're going to give people more money or get close to a full PFD, it's not some energy rebate. That seems like political spend to me. This is a payment of your full PFD this year, and we're going to honor it. And then we move on from there. But that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Okay, I think my reaction to high oil prices is, now is the time, as much as anything, to sort of get things solved. And that's probably not conventional wisdom in the Capitol, but I think the ideal time to make big structural decisions is when your back isn't necessarily against the wall. It's sort of human nature and certainly political nature to want to only make necessary decisions when your back is against the wall. But our back was against the wall. We've been given sort of a geopolitical pass here with the invasion of a sovereign country and skyrocketing oil prices, and who knows how long it will last. But it would be great to solve the big questions. As far as the PFD this year, I sort of see the PFD this year as a continuation of the last number of years, which is there's uncertainty, there's non-alignment within the legislature, and absent solving the big fundamental structural questions, I don't think there will be alignment on a statutory dividend.
If there's a sudden windfall, or well, not a windfall, but a sudden infusion of money because of spiking oil prices, that's only indirectly benefiting the permanent fund. There is a benefit there. But if there's a problem with fuel prices in Alaska, it's a selective problem. There are a lot of people who, either because they don't have to commute or they don't use a lot of motor fuels and everything, should they get the same amount of money out of something tied to the earnings reserve account as somebody who desperately needs fuel out in the bush where it's expensive? Any payment to alleviate energy, in my opinion, my view, should be needs-based. And what we really ought to be doing is taking this windfall and doing things like start repaying the constitutional budget reserve, consider putting more money into the permanent fund. We have a habit. I mean, it's an election year. Spending money is really popular in an election year. Saving money is not particularly popular any of the time. So, this is more my personal opinion, and it's kind of unrelated to the permanent fund defenders, but we ought to be looking to solve the critical needs of the select people who are really hurting because of energy prices. Not Joe Geldoff, not Natasha von Imhoff, everything. We can fill up our tanks, and get along. But we ought to be looking at saving this money that's spiking and perhaps putting some in the permanent fund itself, the corpus, using it for inflation proofing. Inflation's up to what, 6% now, Larry?
I think you're exceeding the short answer, Joe.
Yes, and that's where I'm going to stop.
Anyone else?
I'll just real briefly. This is my inner Republican conflicting with my outer socialist. Hey, we're getting a lot of money off the high oil prices. Let's save some. Oil prices are going to go down. They always do.
Thank you. Let's see. We have a question from Ron in Fairbanks. 9 other states have sovereign wealth funds. Texas has around 70 billion in its 2, which are used to fund primary or secondary and higher education. Mm-hmm. Keeping the approach to Texas in mind, what are your priorities with respects to how the POMV under Senate Bill 26 draw should be spent in Alaska? It's more of a budget question, but any comments?
I'll jump in for a second, Scott. I mean, this is a pretty tough question to answer in the sense of, right now we're just putting it into the fund or the UGF and it gets divvied up into the program. So it's kind of hard to, unless you're going to go back to which we changed the language in 2017 from, what I would call pass through of the dividend payment. There was the earnings that passed through and it was paid. And then they've really obfuscated where that money comes from now. I mean, last year, the way the Senate Finance side did it, I mean, they basically had 3 different funds paying for it and it had nothing to do with the permanent fund for how, so it's really a lot of smoke and mirrors going on. And, we're kind of into the DGF, are we going to designate funds now and how we would spend it? And so that's a pretty complicated question. It's going to violate our short answer rule to get into it. If you just dump that money into the UGF and we spend it, I would finish that with, though, I do agree with the previous comments for both Larry and Joe that, look, I'd even be a fan of writing the checks and paying off some of our debt. Like I said, when you have money, use it wisely. Inflation proof, maybe catch up on some capital projects that we're way behind on, write a check with a little bit of debt and put some money away. We can do all of that right now. Why wouldn't we? Do what's right with the money while you have it until we don't, because like Jonathan said, we're not backed up against the wall. Let's solve some of our problems right now, as opposed to just having these ethereal arguments about what we're going to do with it long term.
And maybe I could add, yes, Texas has the savings accounts that they use to fund education because they have other revenue coming in. The state of Texas has a 6.25% sales tax. Municipalities can put 2% on top of that. If we had an 8.25 combined sales tax, we have plenty of money to solve everything. So it gets to some of the questions Senator Schauer talked about earlier. It's what do you want to use to pay for the dividends and services? Where are you going to get the money? How are you going to balance things? So yeah, Texas, pretty heavy sales tax.
In the spirit of brevity, I'll ditto Larry's comments.
Before Joe goes, I'm just going to comment to that. We don't even need that, Larry. I've done the math. I briefed it on Senate floor last year before anybody else did, and we went through it in the fiscal policy working group. You can go as low as 2% and generate the money we need. So it's just, there's variable answers. The point is that you don't have to have a massive sales tax or any tax to get there to make the math work. It can be much less than that, but you're going to need something. That's
I agree. We don't need 6.25 plus more.
Real short, fix the PFD by putting a good formula in the Constitution, then Do targeted cuts to government. When you're done with that, marry up the government services with your available funds. That's the path to follow. That's a conceptual path, but that's what I think needs to be done.
Didn't the House just change the minimum law to get married?
Not the issue we're talking about tonight,
Not the Senate.
Okay.
Let's see. Let's take a question. We've heard a lot about the permanent fund dividend tonight. I guess it is the hot button political issue that's been around since 2015. Now we're 6 years down the road. Let's see, I guess just in sort of a wrap up, but we might have questions that emerge here. What are some other issues related to the permanent fund dividend that the public should be aware of who are online right now?
I'll jump in quickly. The permanent fund dividend, and we've explored that. There's other issues related to the permanent fund, including the need to inflation-proof the permanent fund. Right now, it's only by statute, which is, of course, something that the legislature can ignore. They don't have to appropriate money to inflation-proof. We've done a pretty good job at inflation-proofing, but it's not an absolute locked-in requirement in our Constitution. That's something. And the other thing is, there's increasing evidence that some of the trustees of the Permanent Fund Corporation are now politicizing the people's fund here and are screwing around with investment strategies, that are not based on the prudent investment rule. And that should be of great concern to everybody, because if they start fooling around with the permanent fund investment strategy and politicizing it, it's going to go the way of like the Alberta Heritage Fund down the toilet.
Anyone else? So, Joe, I guess you did mention the prudent investor rule of the permanent fund and the permanent fund board. The legislature actually is dealing with a piece of legislation that Jonathan Christ Tompkins introduced, as well as the governor, relating to divesting the permanent fund assets that are currently in Russia. Is that something that we should consider, or should we should we just use the prudent investor rule regardless of where the money goes?
Well, I think a prudent investor would have been wary of Russia for a lot of reasons. The place is a kleptocracy. And now that they've taken to invading other countries, you have all kinds of reasons that confirm the place is maybe not the best place to do. You've got large corporations, BP pulling out of there. So fortunately, the permanent fund doesn't have a huge stake in Russia, but arguably they should have been out of there, months ago. It's appropriate for the legislature to do a resolution or a sense of the legislature that this isn't such a good deal. But, there's a good reason why any financial investment should take place according to prudent investment rule, and not start allowing people to say, oh, I've got a pal who needs money for a strip mall in Fairbanks or Anchorage, and we're going to invest in Alaska.
Russia, Joe.
Yeah, well, but
Counselor.
Russia, the prudent investment covers Russia. It's a hothouse investment now, but sticking to the prudent investment rule is the way to go, and that ought to be the foundation of all of our investments, and not political criteria, whether it's Russia or strip malls in Fairbanks.
I'm going to jump in for a second on that, Scott, because it's kind of the military guy here. I do agree with Joe on this one, and I know it's not necessarily popular to say so, but I think when you look at things like an invasion, which, we talked about this on the floor, Scott, you remember I kind of had some problems with some of the language, because I feel like we're beating the drums of war and moving in that direction. And as the military guy that served and has seen the cost of war, I'm not too excited about that plan. I'd rather see us not head down that path. But I think Joe is right that this has to be done non-emotionally based, because emotional investing is one of the possibly worst things you could do. And while I'm not saying that maybe if they looked at the broader picture that getting out of Russian investments would be a bad thing, I think we should leave that up to the experts to do that for us and not be involved politically just because we don't like what Russia did. Well, that may be changing next year. What if they're out in 2 months, it's over and it's all done? And then Russia has, big investment options. They go, we want to do this. So I don't think it should be done emotionally. And I agree with not politicizing how we invest into the fund, because that's today. what matters tomorrow or 6 months from now or 6 years from now might be different. And we need to do this based on those prudent investment rules, not based on the emotions of the day. And that's being said, like I said, as a military guy. And so I just think that we need to be very cautious of allowing our emotions to sweep us away into doing things that may not be in our best interest long-term. And that's not just Russia. That's anything we do. Even you're seeing the politicization of the board right now with the investment or the investigation that's happening in the legislature. This whole thing's becoming political, and it's a very dangerous path, in my opinion.
Thanks, Mike. Anybody else? Jonathan?
I just say there's a big spectrum in terms of what falls under at least the name divestment. And, we're hearing the governor's bill for the first time on Tuesday in the House and in my committee, and looking at what other states and jurisdictions have done. There's a lot of different approaches. But I think one thing that's worth noting, and it's maybe aligned with what Joe said, is the market has basically done the job for us. I mean, our assets in Russia are worthless effectively right now. And there's maybe something to be said about the wisdom of investing in kleptocracies, as Joe said, and that is perhaps an imprudent approach. And the $330 million of state of Alaska assets that were invested in Russia are, now worth maybe, $100 or goodness knows how much. So I would just add.
Okay, let's see. We have time probably for one more question. We do have a question that was on the chat line early on. It related to the permanent fund dividend. Currently, the Constitution says that the legislature has the requirement of supporting public education, public health, public safety, infrastructure, and the university. And we've done that. Adding the permanent fund dividend to the Constitution would be another additive thing. And I got a question is that should the PFD be paid first, as in the idea being first call when it comes to the budget cycle? Anyone?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay. Good.
It's an easy one. Education, public safety, got to come before a dividend. If it were to come to that's the last dollar on the table, what are you going to do?
I would push back on the premise of the question, because ideally you're not having some tug of war about $1 on the table and all these very sort of fundamental needs fighting for it. And I mean, while for me education and social services and these others, that is vitally important, and in some Mad Max world, like, yes, I think those things are more important than a dividend. Ideally, you have a reasonable, rational accommodation that allows for all of those things to coexist in a sustainable way.
And I will add to that very briefly that I think that, in some ways the dividend does accomplish some of those things, because we used it for homeschooling our children. I know my daughter uses it for that, for public safety and other things. I mean, there's parts of that actually does flow into how people might use that. So it is useful, not just in the sense of, you hear like cash value. I know that a certain senator says that word a lot, but I've asked people, what's that cash value? I said, when's the last time you called troopers? I never have. When's the last time you called fire department? I never did. Never used EMS. We homeschooled our kids. So, what of the cash value of all those government services do I really use besides a lot of government regulation in my life and property taxes? So, it's not fairly distributed throughout the state. And so I agree with Jonathan. It's a much more complex issue to talk about than that. And the dividend, remember, those dollars, ICER even said it circulates about 7 times through the economy. So, if we've, not paid $10 billion worth of dividends in the last, 6-7 years, that's $70 billion worth of circulation. And I know that's not apples to apples, but that's a big deal. That's a lot of money that could have circulated through the hands of our private industry, and private economy. So it's not as simple as that question is. And so I agree with that, but there are other ancillary benefits that many people get from that dividend to help them live their lives and do things. And it's not equal cash value, because not everybody takes advantage of those services.
Is there another question from the chat room? I think the 2 previous speakers exhausted that one. Good job.
Okay, well, we're coming up on the top of the hour here. We have 10 minutes left, and the script says that we are supposed to end promptly at 8 o'clock. I just wanted to let folks maybe have a couple minutes for comments, and then we'll end that there. So,
Can I jump in, Scott, with a comment?
sure. Absolutely, John.
There hasn't been a question to this end, but I think a big factor in all of this, in terms of the dividend, the permanent fund, these fundamental issues that are tying Alaska in a pretzel, really comes down to sort of trust and working relationships in the legislature. And I think in my mind, that is as big an obstacle, if not the biggest obstacle, than the actual math and mechanics of the policy with the issues at hand. And it's worth sort of naming that or addressing that as well. And it's really sort of concerning and distressing to me. And in some ways, I think there's sort of causes for hope. And in some ways, I'm deeply distressed by the trend lines. But I actually think the math and the policy, that's solvable. But the ultimate sort of upstream problem that needs to be tackled is the sort of ability or culture to solve problems and sort of trust each other and disagree without being disagreeable within the legislative institution and process.
I will mention that, Scott, because the three of us were on that group and we found a way over a long time to solve those problems and step off of our positions. And I don't disagree with Jonathan. It's one of my concerns, which I keep circling back to the Constitutional Convention. I think it's going to be difficult for us to get past those obstacles, as much as I would like to see us do it. And I think it's going to lead us down the path of that convention, which is going to present a whole host of challenges all by itself. But if we cannot solve that problem in the next, 6-7 weeks here or less, that's the path we're on. And so it's up to us. And I wish I could be optimistic as well, but I have some of the same concerns that Jonathan does.
I'll jump in before Larry so that he can have the last word. The great oil wealth that flowed into the state because of Prudhoe Bay and a few other fields here has been phenomenal. And the amount of money that we saved into the permanent fund, and some legislators, and there was some leadership, we've added to that, and we have inflation-proofed it. It's arguably the best idea that we've undertaken since statehood. And I say that because we're getting this money from a non-renewable resource, and we're saving it for future generations, this one-time tranche of oil that's come in. I really do think it was the best idea. And one of the next best ideas that we did was to have a dividend to give a little slice of the earnings to the citizens to use for whatever they want in some ways. And many, many people spend it responsibly. The establishment of the fund, the establishment of the dividend are now getting old. I'm old. It is time to take a hard look at how we should go forward with the dividend. But we need to protect the dividend, and we need to put it in the Constitution, not just for us, but for future generations. I think we can do that, but we've talked about the math problems, the political problems, and those have to be solved. Else we'll just keep ripping ourselves apart, and we will squander the best idea and the opportunity that we've created since statehood. So we can do it, but it's going to take citizens to have to give up on, getting exclusively what they want. It's not likely the statutory formula is going to get embedded in the Constitution, but there is a way, if there's good faith and listening as much as talking at or past people. So I enjoyed being on this debate and sparring a little bit with all of you, but thank you, Senator Kawasaki, for facilitating this.
Thank you.
I guess I would like to agree with Senator Schauer and Representative Christ-Tompkins in that the divisiveness that has permeated Alaska politics and national politics is part of the problem. It's gotten worse over the years at both levels. And the 60 legislation, the governor got to figure out how to put some of that aside, because as Senator Schauer said, if we don't, and we get a constitutional convention, who the hell knows what's going to happen? So I think trying to work better with each other and step back from some lines that we've all drawn would behoove all of us and the state to come up with something that works, or as works well enough to gain enough support, and as the senator said, gains enough support from the public that we can actually move ahead onto other issues.
Scott, I'll get wrap up as well. So I know that, we talk about this, and I agree with Joe. It's a very important and one of the really kind of gemstones, of a program that you can do that everybody, both the state and the people, get a chance to, benefit from the wealth that's extracted out of our state. I wish we did a little more value adding to that, like in refineries and minerals and other things, but that's for another discussion. And it is true, some people spend it unwisely, but some don't. Some use it, to survive and help, get, life expenses out of the way that otherwise it would be tough for them. So that's one of the reasons I will always struggle to not try to protect this program in whatever measure I can, because most people I know, they use it to help them get by, like my daughter and other folks. So I'm going to very jealously guard this program and protect it to the best of my ability, because I see the use of it. And, quite frankly, I hear some people use it as quality of life. And, sometimes it's almost like certain legislators get mad about that. Nobody on this call here, and I'm like, so what? They use it to buy a big screen TV and they're happy. Why do you care? I mean, if quality of life, happy citizens are good citizens. I don't care if people are happy about stuff. That should be a good, positive thing for us. If people can have the point in their life where they can do that, that's great. I mean, most countries where I travel all over the world, people are barely have food on the table. So my last points here, and I'll finish up, is that, all of us, and, like Larry just said, we've got to get past our personal positions. Everybody on this call has done that, has been willing to step off of their personal stuff if it's going to help us solve the problem. We have to solve it. That's what my goal is here. And I am tired of hearing people accuse a lot of us, including myself and guys here, whether you're left of spectrum, right of spectrum, of, being divisive, not working together. That's baloney. I'm working with Chris Tuck, and JKT is on that group with me, working on a bipartisan election bill. And that's not germane to this discussion, but don't tell me we can't work together, because we are, to find where we can meet in the middle to do something that's a positive step for all of us. A whole bunch of us did it on the fiscal policy working group. But people have got to listen, and leadership in the body, both in the executive and the legislative branch, have got to listen to the people that are willing to step off and do this. And we've done it, and some of us are doing it. But people have to be willing to help us make that happen. And that's a little longer than I wanted, but I think it's important that people hear that some of us are working together and we are trying. It's just a matter of can we get enough people to do it and make it work? So thanks, guys. I enjoyed this, and I think it was a really good discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And thank you all the participants here. There were over almost 500 comments just on this chat in the last hour and a half. I hope you get a chance to read them. If you probably weren't able to switch back and forth between screens, but I was monitoring them, asked some of the questions that were on there. Of course, we had over 65 questions that were asked. We got through the first maybe 5 or 6 in an hour and a half. And that's kind of what I expected would happen. As Senator Schauer said, we are working together. We want to make sure that folks know that we are here. It's not just this debate tonight, that we will be here in the legislature. We're just after day 60 right now, anticipating another 60 days before we meet the 120-day constitutional limit. Sorry, Schauer. But that's kind of what we expect. I think we're going to try and work faster than that. And we've seen that we've worked pretty fast in the Senate, and the House is sort of catching up now. They're hitting budget amendment time in the House Finance Committee this week. The Senate Finance Committees are meeting in subcommittees, and we are discussing the overall budget as well as the permanent fund dividend, which is a big, crucial issue. Also wanted to say, we are working together, as Senator Schauer said. The 2 legislators who were on, as well as myself, were part of the fiscal policy work group, very disparate group as far as thoughts about policy, about where we're going. But we all came to agree to some certain guiding principles. I think that's amazing. Folks want to hear where we're divided, where we're not working well together. The newspapers put it out, the radio, television, always want to hear about where we disagree. but a lot of times we agree, and we are working very hard together to find a solution as a group together. We're incredibly blessed to live in a state like this. We have a permanent fund dividend. No other state does. We have $80 billion. I think at one time we had more in our permanent fund dividend than the rest of the 9 states that have a sovereign wealth fund together combined. That's pretty amazing. We haven't had to pay taxes or exorbitant taxes over the last 30 years. We do have a high cost of living. That's kind of expected up in Alaska. But we have open land, clean waters. We've got a lot of things that we are grateful for here in this state. So I want to just thank folks who are online tonight, thank the 4 panelists, and let folks know that if you do have questions, you can forward them to me, and I'll make sure that they get to members of the legislature. So with that, it's now 8:01, and we're going to end on time. I again thank all the panelists for being here tonight. Thanks for giving us your evening, and thank all the folks that are online watching and listening.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Hello, my fellow Alaskans. Thank you all for tuning in here tonight, listening to the great Alaskan debate for our permanent fund dividend as the legislators down there in Juneau and the PFD defenders representative there and Scout Kawasaki supposed to be the mediator in between, and they only got to about 6 of the, I'm sure, well, that they said close to 500 people or questions between them all, 65 there on Zoom or whatnot, tons on Facebook, and they only got to about 6 of the questions, which is not surprising. The legislators, we got to listen to them have the great debate of why they think the permanent fund dividend is the only solution to curing their budget woes down there in Juneau, and here's all the different ways we would like to do it. And yes, we agree that, or some of them anyways, agree that the old statutory PFD law is the law that should be being followed until it is changed. That is the law of the land. And the majority down there, it seemed that were talking and debating, their arguments are all for it goes to government first and the scraps go to Alaskans second, and if there's nothing left after they get done, as in what they consider the scraps to us, they'll just spend it and we get nothing. That has been their goal and objective, and if you look at all the bills that are being pushed through down there in Juneau right now, it's exactly that. Look at the huge $3.5 billion windfall that Governor Dunleavy came out and announced, and that's just for this year. That's $3.5 billion for this year. Scott Kawasaki tried to play it off as this is a multi-year revenue report that he just received there. No, that is the projected revenue for the end of this year. That's $3.5 billion above and beyond what the current fiscal budget is budgeted out to be, which is also $158 million more than they had last year for the fiscal budget. At least that's what the House presented that I live streamed, I believe it was about a week and a half ago or so. And so here's where everything stands at right now. We're listening at legislators saying, oh, we can't change anything, ignore the worst in the nation education, which not a single one of them brought up, at double to triple the cost in anywhere else in the nation. It depends on where you live if you consider that double to triple. Overall, we're about triple the cost almost of the rest of the nation. We are like the 2nd or 3rd highest in the nation for what it costs per child for education. And we've got the worst results. When the Department of Education came out and announced that we were ranked 52 out of the United States and also ranked worse than some third world countries out there when it came to our education, and we're doing that at double the triple the cost. I mean, there's a solution there that can be fixed. They're doing it with homeschooling. Fairbanks is currently trying to change that around, but the school district doesn't want to give up their control over the homeschool program, so they're trying to take their hybrid COVID learning that they had going on and turning that into a homeschool using one of the schools that they just recently closing down at the end of this year to no longer be open. They're going to reopen it again as a homeschool program under the current Alaska School District program, so that they'll still have the control, they'll still have the full funding coming to them, because they'll claim them as butts sitting in the seat. Where homeschool programs, actual real homeschool programs that are producing the best results in our state currently for graduation rates and success of students graduating people early, years before their 18th birthday. But they don't want to talk about any of that, nor do they want to talk about the $3.65 billion Department of Health and Social Services budget this next coming up year. $3.65 billion. Man, I just shake my head when I see things like that, and it just really amazes me. I mean, the current budget for education has jumped from $1.3 billion to $1.6 billion, $1.65 billion is what they propose this year, $30-some billion to, about a $50 million if you look at the House's, $30 million if you look at the Senate's version for it, but an increase in their budgets. That's if they don't pass the new student-based allocation law that they want for education, which will give them approximately $60,000 more than what they're getting, even though they have 10% less students going to school now than they did last year. And if you go over the overall over the last 10 years, they are overall down 10% lower than what they had in school 10 years ago. So the base school allocation should have been dropped dramatically below where it is right now this year. If they were to follow the law, it'd be about $130 million budget cut from K through 12 and early education's budget this year. But they don't want to follow the law. That's why they're trying to change the law that the new student-based allocation accounts for the less students, because they give out a bigger dollar amount per student that more than compensates for it by about $50 to $60 million. Ironically, that's the same thing that's going on in the House. They have these two different bills competing with each other. If you don't pass the new SBA law bill, we're going to give a one-time funding for $50 million. Which one do you like in our budget? Let us know. But we can't afford to give a full statutory PFD, even though there's $82.5 billion there, excluding the $3.5 billion surplus in tax revenue above and beyond the current fiscal year's budget. So when they say that they have no money to be able to pay the PFD, they're lying. They do not need to do their POMV draw this year. They need nothing, zero, goose eggs, big goose eggs, nada. Not a single penny needs to come from a POMV draw, their SB 26 law. They don't need a cent of that money this year from the ERA to pay for the budget. They have a $3.5 billion surplus sitting there above and beyond what the fiscal budget is right now. They could put that $3.5 billion away and put that into the CBR, and they would find themselves with roughly about $5 billion magically sitting there for next year instead of the $1 billion that they've had sitting there this past year. You get a clue? They got to have it up to a $12 billion before the sweep gets stopped. I mean, I could go on forever about this kind of stuff, but I'm really starting to get back active again. As you can see behind me, if you can't see, I'll give just a quick preview of the showroom going up behind me. We finally got the roof installed here just a few days ago. The wall paneling or the rest of the trim work will be getting done here in the next week. The tin foil will be removed from the window there, and I'm hoping through enough support and donations from you guys to be able to afford to get one of those retractable TV things that I can mount to the top of the ceiling, and I'll push it a button, drop down the television set to be able to show you guys live videos and stuff like that. I've got myself set up with multi-camera angles coming in soon and different things along those lines to help make this a true blue newsworthy broadcast coming out on a daily basis and start covering the news that's going on. So if hopefully you got to sit through the PFD debate today. I heard a lot of double talk, a lot of lies being spread again, that they can't balance the budget. There's no way to cut the budget. They need tax revenue before they'll even JKT. I need tax revenue assurances. We need to have it in writing that we're going to have the tax revenue to make up for the lack of tax revenue to pay a permanent fund dividend, even though for 40 years the earnings reserve account is where that money has come out of up until Walker. And when Walker took away our first PFD, that money didn't get withdrawn from the ERA. And ever since then, the Alaska legislators have been in control of the ERA, and they dictate where all that money is going to get spent. Last year's dividend didn't even get paid using 1 red cent of our ERA's fund. They took all that money from different accounts out of the government's fund, their tax revenue that we've paid into the state. Out of that tax revenue is how they paid us a permanent fund dividend, which contradicts the law 100%. The year before that, they did a 50-50 mix, and they've been slowly diluting it. And I called it out when it first happened many years ago. You can dig through my stuff and find it. I'm sure it's there. And so you guys got all a good clue of what's going on here in Alaska. Like and share this. Go to my website, politidic.com. Click that support button. All proceeds go right back into helping me keep expanding what I'm doing. I'm coming up with free stream services fees and stuff like that for covering the website, which will be having a lot more updated and new information being added here real shortly. Now that I finally got things ironed out in a lot of different directions. Health has been one of them. My health has definitely made a big churn for the positive here in the past few weeks, and I am just about back to full energy enough to get back doing this full time again. Thank you all for tuning in again. Don't forget to like and share. Really do appreciate you guys all being here today. And I am going to go ahead and sign on out here, and make sure you like and share.